Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. This is a show for the Christian woman who is driven and inspiring, sensitive yet strong. And maybe, like me, you've felt like you're a little bit too much at times. I want you to remember that you, my friend, are a chosen daughter of the King, and you have been fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and I'm joined by my co-host, Holly Kane, and sometimes by other guests as well. Join us as we discuss leadership as Christian women in our churches, business or workplace, our communities, and our homes. We're so glad that you're here with us. Now on to the episode. Welcome to the very first episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. We are so glad you are here with us. I'm Esther Littlefield, and I'm here with my co-host and very good friend, Holly Kane.
Hi, Esther. I'm very happy to be here with you. In this episode, we're going to tell you why we are starting this podcast, a little bit about our stories, and what you can expect from our podcast. Esther, can you tell me a little bit about why you wanted to start this podcast?
Sure, I would love to. So I have been listening to podcasts avidly for a few years now. I just absolutely love podcasts. I listen to as many as I can. Some people might say I'm a bit of an addict. So
I would say that.
Yeah. And, I always have a story about, well, there's a podcast about that. But when I was listening to podcasts, one of the things that I love listening to podcasts about is leadership and, being a Christian woman, being in ministry myself as a pastor's wife. I often will listen to podcasts related to ministry. But what I came across in that is that most of those podcasts are done by men, oftentimes pastors who are amazing. And I love listening to those podcasts. And some of them are very specific to church ministry, which again is fabulous. But I was finding that a lot of those podcasts didn't necessarily speak to the unique challenges and joys of being a woman in ministry. And so that was one of the reasons that I was starting to think about a podcast for Christian women in leadership.
So you really saw a hole that we could fill, is really what it sounds like.
Absolutely. Yes. And the other thing that I found is that there's a lot of podcasts for Christian women. There are so many wonderful podcasts for Christian moms, for growing in your faith. There's some great podcasts, even by some friends of mine, that are specific to growing your faith as a Christian woman, but they weren't specific to leadership. And so again, I was actually searching for a podcast that I could listen to that was about leadership as a woman. And then I also was finding podcasts for entrepreneurs, and a lot of them sometimes would be actually specific to Christian women business owners. But again, they were specific to business, and they didn't cover the ministry side of things or even the home or family side of things. So even though, those were great if you were in business, a lot of women in leadership are not necessarily also in business. Some of us are. But I was just finding that there was a big need, a big hole in the podcasting world for this type of podcast. And I've actually had the idea for doing a podcast for a while. But as I was listening, I realized that this was the topic and the type of podcast that I would want to start, because I saw that there were other Christian women in leadership that would love to hear a woman's perspective, not just a man's perspective. And again, there's nothing wrong with either one of those. But, as a woman, I wanted to hear from other women, other pastors' wives, other women in business leadership, how they were handling situations or how they were growing as a leader. So that's when I had the idea, and I actually decided to ask Holly to join me because, one, She's a good friend of mine. Two, she is an amazing leader herself, and
thank
has a heart for ministry. Yeah. We've actually led things together. We've been in ministry together, and we have lots of fun together. So I said, hey, Holly, well, you want to join me on this crazy adventure? So that's how we got started.
And I love this idea because there are so many people that kind of separate the two between ministry and business, and so many of the principles and the techniques that you use and all of those sorts of things really cross over and can be used in both places. And really, how we act in either of those two realms shouldn't be any different. How we act in our business world and our business interactions shouldn't be much different than how we carry ourselves at church ministry and how we deal with volunteers or people that are working with us. So I think there's a really great mesh between the two worlds that we can kind of strike and sort of talk about the things that really are important to both of those sides. So
Absolutely.
I'm excited.
Awesome. So I wanted us to share a little bit in this episode as well about our own stories. So those of you listening could understand kind of where we're coming from and our background, and just why we can even speak to this topic of leadership. So Holly, I'd love to start with you telling me a little bit about your leadership journey and kind of how you've gotten to a place in your life where you now realize that you are a leader.
Sure. So I guess I would not have thought of myself as a leader growing up. I was at times shy, but also pretty outgoing. And it just kind of depended on where I was at. But I I found that it was very easy for me to kind of take a back seat to other people if they wanted to lead. So I would have never thought of myself as a leader. But um, kind of found as I moved forward in my life that if there were group projects or peer groups, I always seemed to be the one who was organizing things and delegating things. And if no one else would take the lead, I would happily jump in. And so I kind of went along that way and didn't really think of it as something I could develop. And then in college, I started doing Campus Crusade at our college. We had a leadership team, and the ministry had sort of waned. And so I kind of thought, this really is something that we need to be doing for this area. And so myself and a couple other people really tried to ramp that up, and I was on the leadership team for that. We also had work study, and I just naturally started leading in that area as well. I just kept naturally doing that, and I guess I just figured that I was bossy and thought that all of my ways were right. But people, for the most part, just happily went along with whatever I said. So I don't know if that's actually leadership or not, but yeah, so people would just kind of follow along with what I said, and I went with it. I think that church, as I got married and got older, was really where I started growing in leadership. And most often it was something that I saw a need that wasn't really being fulfilled, and just kept plugging away, but never really thought of myself as a leader.
Okay. So was there a point in your life when you actually realized that you are a leader?
I think honestly, it hasn't been until more recently that I actually gave myself that title. Even though I was happy to lead ministries or be in charge of things, I never really gave myself that title. And I think that's really important because when you give yourself the title, there's a sense of responsibility that comes with that, where you know that this is something that you might be inclined towards, but obviously we don't start off in our giftings absolutely perfect. So
Mm-hmm.
I think I think over the past few years I've been able to think of myself in that way, and that has made a lot of difference because I look at it as something that I can grow and develop. So church is definitely where those sorts of things were developed. I've been working in women's ministry. I've done Operation Christmas Child. I've headed that up at our church. I've done fundraising campaigns, mission trips, that sort of thing. And so at church, I felt very comfortable doing that, but I wasn't really in that role at work. Again, the same sort of peer group thing. If there was a peer group, I had no problem leading, but I didn't really feel like a leader at work until I was able to get promoted into a position in a small business that I used to work at. I was really able to help steer that business, that small business, and, really have my ideas. There was weight to my ideas. People were listening to me and they thought the things that I said were important. And it was then that I started to think, okay, this is not just church. I'm also a leader at work.
Right.
And, I really stepped into that role and really very much enjoyed steering that small business for the time that I was able to be there.
Right. It makes such a huge difference when you're validated as a leader,
Yeah.
when other people that aren't just like your husband or your best
Yeah.
friend actually are giving weight, like you said, to your
Yeah.
ideas and your thoughts and really your leadership. So that's
And I
amazing.
think that really was the biggest factor in me realizing that I was a leader. Someone telling me that I could, or putting their faith in my abilities.
Mhm.
I was like, okay, I really can do this, even though those things may have been there all along. I think that when someone calls out those things in you, it really, as you said, it validates them and it really helps you realize where your giftings are and where you can be growing and changing. So I very much appreciate people who said to me, no, you can do this. Like, I definitely see you in this role. And, you know, I'll be forever grateful for those people. So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
That's absolutely amazing.
yeah.
So, what about, one of the things that leaders often do is they also have some kind of message that they feel that they want to share with the world, which is part of the reason we're doing this podcast is to
Right.
to share a message. So, was there any point in your life that you realized or started to develop a desire to really share a message with other people?
hmm So I think that has definitely come to me only in the past, I would say 2 to 3 years. We have a wonderful women's ministry at our church, and we're so blessed to have a really great women's minister who has been my personal mentor. And she has just poured into me and really, as I said before, called out those giftings in me. And so, as we sort of have gone through different events and different things through women's ministry, I felt like at first it was just me forming my own opinion and being kind of really feeling like my way was the best way. But as I understood that I was a leader, I was like, you know what? I think that this is a message and this is perhaps a calling on my life that God has given me. And I want to see women's ministries all over the country flourish. I think that this is a great time that we're living in for this type of thing. And I think that we've already seen this, but I think that there's, a wave of a movement, I guess, if you will,
Hmm.
happening. And I
Right.
think the space is not overfilled. There's always room for more women encouraging and leading. And there's always room for women who are looking out for the underdog or the underserved or whatnot. So I want to encourage churches and I want to encourage women's ministers, or maybe not specifically in a church, but ministries directed at women, to really not rely on how we used to do things, to
Right.
create a community where old ways can be challenged a bit. So I
Right.
think that, I definitely have a voice in that space, and
Yeah.
I want to be, you know, I want to be challenging what we're doing and really talking about and how we are, I guess, how we're going after underserved women, not necessarily in the church space, but in our daily lives. So
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
And I think that what you just said is an example of the fact that when you are a leader, you challenge the status quo a lot of times, and you look
Yeah.
at things with a different lens, and you're not afraid to speak up when you
Hmm.
think maybe we need to look at this and do things a little bit differently. And
Yeah.
or maybe sometimes we are afraid to speak up, but that's part of why we're doing this podcast, to
Right,
try and
exactly.
help encourage women. Like you said, there's voices,
Yeah.
there's room for all of us as women
Hmm.
to use our gifts that God has given us. And that's really my passion, is to help all of us as women embrace those gifts and actually walk in them. And I know
Right.
that's a big passion of yours as well. So I'm excited.
I
And I think that probably in the future we'll get into, talking more about specifically women's ministry in churches and some of the stuff you
Right.
were talking about, because I know that there's a lot of conversation we could have around that, and how to encourage women leaders in churches
Hmm.
to do things differently. So I
Right.
love that.
Okay, so I'm excited to talk to you about your journey as well. Esther is one of my favorite people. She is such a leader, and the thing that I love about her is how consistent she is. I think we're opposite in that. She's really good at sort of that drip, drip, kind of keep plugging away. And I'm really good for, that burst of energy, and then I kind of fall back. So we complement each other really well. And
Yes.
I'm really excited about what she has to say. So, can you tell me a little bit about your leadership journey?
Sure. So it's kind of a similar journey to what you said, Holly.
Mhm.
I was the oldest child. I just have one younger sister, but I was also often in the neighborhood where we lived. Part of my childhood, I think I was one of the older children, or the oldest child for a certain time period. And I was often the one that was in charge. I was often the one called bossy, because I liked to orchestrate. If we were going to have a play in the neighborhood, I was the
Mm.
one orchestrating everything that needed to happen, and who should go where and what needed to be said. But at the same time, especially going into, I think, older elementary school and middle school, I was very shy, very insecure, and I didn't talk to people unless they talked to me first. We moved around a lot as a child as well. My whole family, we moved a lot growing up. And so I never really felt like I fit in anywhere.
Mhm.
And at the same time, in school situations, I was often, like you said, chosen to be, the leader in group projects, but I always just thought it was because I got good grades. And so I thought people just wanted me for my A, my chances of getting an A. So that never occurred to me that maybe I was a leader. And so as I got older, in eighth grade, I was actually nominated to speak at our graduation. I have no idea why, but I did. And I spoke, and I shook the whole time. I was so afraid. In high school, I ended up going to a leadership conference with other students in the state. And again, apparently going to a leadership conference still didn't inform me that I maybe was a leader. And then, getting older, went into college, and I ended up co-leading a ministry we had a ministry at my college that went into Boston and worked with homeless people.
Mhm.
And I ended up co-leading that my second year at school. And then I also co-led a missions trip later in my college years. So kind of just, over the years, I was growing as a leader, but not realizing that I was a leader, or not calling myself that, like you said. So once I got married, my husband and I helped out at our church. We got really involved in the youth group, and then my husband ended up becoming the youth pastor. And
Mhm.
so I was kind of inherently in leadership because of his role as the youth pastor. Over time, we ended up getting involved in a marriage ministry type of situation, where we attended a marriage retreat for many years. And then we realized, um, after seeing some big changes in our own marriage, that
Mhm.
maybe God was asking us to do that type of ministry for our church, because we'd always just gone to a retreat and not actually um, led it. And so we ended up deciding to put together a retreat and plan it for people at our church, and leading that. Um, and then about 5 or 6 years ago, I started a women's Bible study. And that became just such a blessing to me.
Mm.
And I was really actually afraid to start it. I was afraid to lead it. I didn't feel like I was qualified or that I actually had any reason that I should be the one leading the group, but I started it and then God blessed it and God did amazing things. Um, and finally, I think 2 or 3 years ago, I realized, oh, okay, looking back over my life, I spent a little bit of time reflecting and I thought, okay, I think there's actually a theme here and that maybe being a leader is part of who I am and the way God made me.
Mhm.
So that's really kind of how I came to came to the recognition that I am a leader.
Isn't it interesting that both of us, even though we went through all of that and were really a part of all of those different things, that neither of us realized that we could actually wear the title leader? That says a lot about how we were raised, or maybe the time frame that we were raised in.
Yeah,
And I think it kind of says a lot about how we can be raising up leaders in the future. That sounds
absolutely.
like a great podcast.
Oh yeah. It is true because this is another interesting thing. When I thought back on my childhood, I can specifically remember walking around my neighborhood or, around my yard. And in my head, I was like preaching sermons and
Yeah.
I had all these thoughts and ideas. And I was
Mhm.
in my head, I was speaking to a group of people, telling them my thoughts and ideas.
Mhm.
But I never I never did that in any capacity until much
Right.
later in life, but like you said, I didn't really have that sense, and then no blame on my family or anybody in my
Yeah.
life. I just never took ownership of the fact that I could maybe have a message to share or
Mhm.
that I would have, potentially a way of leading people that nobody else could do other than
Right.
me. That God maybe had something specific for me that other people wouldn't do because they didn't have my same experiences and my same story.
I'm glad that you mentioned that you have a message to share. And part of realizing that you were a leader, I think, at least for me, and you can say if it happened differently for you, right along the same time that I realized I was a leader, I also realized what my message was. It kind
Mm.
of came along together. So, how did you develop, or when did you develop that desire to share a message with others? And what, I guess, is that message?
Right. So, like I said, I think I had a desire to share a message from when I was young. Those thoughts in my head. I wish I had written some of them down because it would be really interesting to look back and see
Mm.
what it was I was preaching in my head at the time. I really would love to hear those sermons. But no, I think probably 7 or 8 years ago when my husband and I went through a very difficult time in our marriage and came out the other side. I had a heart for women and women in ministry in particular because I knew the loneliness of being a pastor's wife
Mm.
and feeling like no one else understood. No one else could relate. And I couldn't really talk to anyone because I was the pastor's wife. And,
Mm.
there's this different level of ability to share when you are in leadership. You can't just share to the same extent that you do if you're not in a leadership position. It's like if you're the boss at work, you can't sit down and talk to the people, your employees,
Mhm.
and tell them all your personal problems because you're the boss. So
Absolutely.
anyway, so I developed a heart for women and I started writing on my blog. I already had a blog, but I started writing more specific to women in ministry, about marriage, about the ways that we need to take care of ourselves and really pour into what God might have for us as women and accept what God has for us in our leadership and in our ministry in order to pour back out and actually lead. So I just became very passionate about the fact that we cannot lead others and we cannot be effective in our ministry unless we're taking care of ourselves, unless we are personally connected with God, with the
Mhm.
source of
Right.
all of our fulfillment. So that's really where my message started. And it over the past few years, as I've done more and I've actually started a business and gotten more involved in the business space, I have seen, like you said earlier, the connections between being in the business world and being in ministry and the leadership roles there, so
Mhm.
much overlap, that I really want to help women accept who they are, accept how God has made them, and then be able to go out and impact the world around them. So
Right. I
yeah.
love that. I think that's so perfect. So, were there any specific life events? I know you talked about marriage retreats and kind of going through the marriage struggles that you had. Were there any other life events that contributed to you becoming a leader?
So I think this is something that we'll probably talk about in a future episode a little bit more, but for me, there's always that question of, are you born a leader or do you develop
Mm,
as a leader?
right.
And I think that's a good, that'll probably be a topic for a future episode. But when I was 13, I was in eighth grade, my father passed away very suddenly in a tragic accident. And so very quickly my life changed and my faith was tested in a way
Mm,
that most middle schoolers don't experience. And so I think at that point, that was really a turning point for me in my faith. And I think probably in terms of my leadership, because I basically had to grow up a lot faster than
mm,
a lot of people do, and had to experience, a very deep level of grief and learn how to put my faith and my trust in God completely. And so I
mm,
think that that was probably a big influencer
mm.
in me looking to leadership or being able to accept leadership later down the road, because I had that pretty traumatic life event that allowed me to develop and grow and probably impacted my character as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think at that age, I mean, you're already confused about life in general, and so when you get hit with something that tragic, you really have to come to grips with feelings and emotions and self in a way that, you wouldn't necessarily have to do at that age. So,
Right. Yeah.
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 So,
And
yeah.
I
You're probably a lot more you were probably a lot more self-aware at that age than most kids.
right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, basically, that type of situation just completely turns your whole life upside down. So it's just,
Right.
it completely changes your perspective, and you start
Mhm.
to realize that, oh, wait, life isn't all about me.
Yeah.
you know and I learned the appreciation for the brevity of life much earlier
Right.
than a lot of people do, because of having that, having my dad taken so quickly. So
Right.
yeah. What about you?
Yeah.
I didn't ask you earlier if there was anything, any particular events in your life that maybe impacted your leadership.
I think that our first mission trip to Guatemala, I was not actually the leader of that trip. I was just on it. And it was one of those things that my husband, Zach, and I said, this is something we want to do before we have kids. And if we don't do it now, we'll never get the chance. So, and I mean, we felt called by God too. So
That's always a good thing,
that,
right?
that, yeah. um, so we went on that trip, and I think that, I don't know, I think a lot of my leadership spurs from seeing a need somewhere and then feeling like I need to address that need. And
Yeah.
so I guess really going there and seeing how they live and seeing how, um, the need that was out there, really coming face to face with that, I think kind of shaped me to be really looking outside of my own circle or my own sphere. And
Right.
it kind of opened my eyes up to, hey, like, the world out there is really big, and there's a lot of people in need. And it's not just, it's not just people outside of my circle, it's people in my community, it's people in my state and my country and, the world really. And so I think if anything opened my eyes up to there being a need in the world, it was definitely that. And while I may not have immediately come home and started leading something, it opened my eyes to a bigger world out there. And at the same time, helped me realize that while the world is really big, we're all super connected.
Mhm.
And just because I'm, some girl from Maine doesn't mean that I can't positively affect, a mom in the jungles of Guatemala.
Right.
Those are real possibilities. Those are real things that can happen. And God can use my voice in her life, whether it just be from a 5-minute meeting that
Mhm.
we will never see each other again.
Mhm.
Those impactful moments he can really use in people's lives. And so I think that really shaped that part of my mindset or perspective. And it opened my eyes to what was out there.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I think that's something that again, leaders find ways to make a difference, even when it's something that we might call small, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I think there's a temptation to sit around and wait until there's a big thing that we think God wants us to do. But true leadership is actually taking action even when it might just impact one other person. And it just
Right.
might be that you're a blessing to that one person.
Mhm.
Might be your coworker, it might be your best friend, it might be your husband, it might be your child, but you can lead another person in what the world might call a small thing,
Mhm.
and you can still
Right.
make that difference. So that's
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah,
And I
great.
think that's how God grows us in our leadership too. I mean, being able to, in a small group setting or one-on-one or one-on-two or however small the group is, being that voice of encouragement, that voice of positivity, that voice of grace and truth grows you into learning how to do that in bigger and bigger and bigger groups. And when you're
Yes.
able to do it with your friends, especially when, sometimes we as women are really great at, the chatty, gossipy thing,
Mhm.
and if you as a leader are able to turn that conversation and say, here's something positive, or encourage or steer the conversation, those small little things really knock off our rough edges and really expand our scope as to how we can learn to lead. And then it just gets bigger from there. And I think that idea from the Bible, as long as we're faithful in the small things, he will give us bigger things to be faithful with.
Right.
Obviously, that's a really loose paraphrase, but
It's the Holly
you get
paraphrase.
where
Yes.
I'm
Awesome.
going.
Well, I think that brings us to a really good point to talk a little bit about what what you can expect to hear from the Christian Women Leadership Podcast in the future, because what Holly just talked about is, really thinking about what we're going to be looking at for other episodes coming down the road. So we wanted to let you know that we want to bring you the content that's going to be most helpful to you in your leadership journey. And like I said, I really wanted to start this podcast because I wasn't finding something out there for me as a woman in a leadership role. And I was like,
Right.
well, let's just make our own. So we hope that you're going to be both encouraged by the episodes in the future as well as challenged. This is not going to be a let's all sit around and make each other feel good. It's probably going to be, we're going to have some hard conversations, and we're going to be talking about some things that will force you to think and force you to maybe look at things differently, or expand what God might be trying to teach you. So there's going to be a mix of episodes. They're not all going to be the same. So I kind of like that because sometimes I get bored with just the same thing all the time. So
Mhm.
so we got to mix it up. Some of the episodes are going to be Holly and I together like we are right now. And we'll be discussing a particular topic related to leadership. There's also going to be some interviews with Christian women in leadership, some names that maybe you've heard of and some that you may not have heard of. But these are going to be hearing from them, their experiences, their stories as a leader. And we really hope that that will be a blessing to you. And I'm already really excited because we already have a few of these lined up where I already know some women that have said yes to be on the podcast. So I'm excited to get to share those episodes with you guys. And then finally, you may hear some solo episodes from me from time to time that I might be sharing a particular topic or a training with you. And that'll be a lot of fun as well. So, Holly, do you want to tell everybody how they can connect with us and how they can let us know what else they would like to hear from us?
Yes. So I really enjoyed our first podcast and I look forward to doing some more. But really, we would love to talk about the things that are challenging you and that you really need to be encouraged with. And so we'd love to hear your ideas. We have a Facebook group that we would love for you to join. And this is a great community that we really are learning and growing together. So if you want to just hop on over to estherlittlefield.com/group, all you have to do is enter your name and email there, and you'll receive an invite to join our group. It's a great place where you can chat about what you need, what your challenges are, and we'll celebrate our wins together. And so we'd love for you to join us there. We'd love for you to tell us the things that you're encountering, the things that you're running up against, and we'd love to talk about it on the podcast. And we'd love to get to know you. One of the things I've really enjoyed in this group is getting to know the diversity of women that we have in the group, how they're all leading, and just the different things that they are experiencing. And it's been a great opportunity to, as I said before, learn and grow together. So
yeah, the group is absolutely already just blowing me away with how engaged they are and how much fun we're having in there. And another thing I want to mention about the group is that it's a great place to get maybe some bonus content that we may not be sharing on the podcast, but maybe we might share some of the outtakes from the podcast episodes, which could be really interesting.
I think they're going to be a lot of.
Yeah, we'll see how much editing we need to do from this first episode. And then, but we'll also be there, just like Holly said, we truly want to get to know you. So if you are a woman in leadership, whether you have your own business or you are a pastor's wife or you're leading a women's ministry or you are you just want to lead something. Maybe you are a stay-at-home mom, which is absolutely amazing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But maybe you feel a desire to do something at your church or in your community, to start a Bible study, to start some type of, maybe you have a desire to start a movement or some kind of, big thing that could change the world. Like we don't want to limit what God might have to do, but whatever the case might be, we would love to have you join us. So like Holly said, we've had a lot of fun with this first episode. We thank you so much for joining us. And we really are looking forward to sharing more content with you in the future. So thanks again for joining us. And until next time, we'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love for you to subscribe so that you don't miss a future episode. And of course, it would be amazing if you leave a rating and review. This helps more women like you find the podcast and grow in their leadership. If you're not sure how to leave a rating and review, you can click in the podcast app that you are listening to and look for the ratings or review option. Or you can head over to estherlittlefield.com and click on podcast, and we will put some information there about how to leave a rating or review. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters. It's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.